Have you ever stopped to think about the true role of religion in human life? Not just as a set of beliefs, rituals, or institutions, but as a profound force that shapes the psyche, values, and even dreams of an entire civilization? Today, we're going to dive into a perspective that goes far beyond what you're used to hearing in traditional debates. Forget for a moment the discussions between faith and science, between skepticism and spirituality. What we are going to explore here is something much deeper, the look of one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung. Jung did not see religion only as a system of doctrines. For him, religion was an essential expression of the human soul, an inevitable psychological phenomenon, a necessity that springs from the depths of the collective unconscious. But what exactly did he mean by that? What is the true relationship between religion and mental health? And why did Jung believe that ignoring the symbolic aspect of religion could have devastating consequences for the modern individual? Prepare to be amazed by an approach that unites psychology, spirituality, and mythology like you may never have seen before. If you are interested in topics such as self-knowledge, purpose, symbolism, and want to understand how all this connects with the inner world, then this video is for you. Before we start, take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find deep reflections, grounded content, and a community that seeks to go beyond the surface. Activate the bell so you don't miss anything, because what Carl Jung says about religion, you will be surprised. And that's just the beginning. When Carl Gustav Jung began to investigate the mysteries of the human mind, he quickly realized something that many scholars of his day ignored or rejected altogether. Religion was not just a social construct or a product of ignorance, but a natural and profound manifestation of the psyche. For Jung, religion arose from the unconscious spontaneously, as an attempt by the soul to find meaning, direction, and, above all, balance. This view was not religious in the traditional sense. Jung did not defend a specific doctrine or position himself as a preacher of any organized faith. What he did was observe, with the sensitivity of a scientist and the depth of a mystic, how religious symbols appeared in dreams, visions, myths, and personal stories of the patients he treated. He realized that these sacred images, such as the hero, the cross, rebirth, the struggle between good and evil, repeated themselves with astonishing patterns, regardless of one's culture or belief. It was as if there was a universal symbolic language inscribed in the human soul. For Jung, this symbolic universe was what he called the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the mind where archetypes, images, and universal structures that shape our emotions, behaviors, and even our spirituality are stored. And it is precisely at this point that religion comes into play. It works as a channel that allows the individual to access and dialogue with these symbols, helping to build a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between the ego and the self, between what we are and what we can become. Denying this symbolic aspect of religion, according to Jung, is like cutting one of the deepest roots of the human psyche. He believed that, without this dialogue with the sacred, whether understood literally or symbolically, the modern individual runs the risk of living a fragmented, empty existence disconnected from his own essence. This is why so many people, even living in technological and advanced societies, still feel an existential emptiness. It is not just a lack of faith in the traditional sense, but a loss of touch with something greater, something that transcends everyday life and gives meaning to one's personal journey. In his clinical observations, Jung saw the effects of this disconnect up close. Patients with identity crises, existential anguish, and even psychic disorders often didn't just need medication or practical advice. They needed to find meaning again, something that would connect them back to the totality of their being. And often this reunion took place precisely through religious symbols, archetypal images, internal rituals that allowed the reintegration of the self. But it is important to note, Jung did not see religion as a magic solution or an escape from reality. On the contrary, he understood that the true spiritual path requires courage, facing the shadow, accepting suffering as part of the journey, and a commitment to inner transformation. The religious, for him, was not the one who believes blindly, but the one who seeks meaning with honesty, opening himself to the mystery of existence and welcoming the symbols that emerge from the unconscious with respect and attention. This look invites us to rethink the way we see religion in the contemporary world. Instead of treating it as an outdated system, perhaps it is time to listen to it again, not with the ears of dogmatic reason, but with the sensibility of the soul. And it is from this perspective that we can understand why Jung saw the religious symbol as an essential bridge between the internal and external worlds. But what happens when that bridge is destroyed? How does the human being react when he loses contact with the sacred? When this bridge between the individual and the sacred is destroyed, the impact is not only spiritual, it reverberates directly in psychic health. Jung was one of the first to realize that the loss of connection with religious symbols and the inner world created a dangerous void, a kind of existential disorientation that could not be filled with science, technology, or consumption alone. He saw this happening over and over again in his patients. Highly educated people, apparently successful, but who carried a quiet anguish, a feeling that something essential had been lost along the way. This something was, for Jung, the central axis of psychic life, meaning. When the individual disconnects from the symbolic meaning of existence, he may even continue to function in the external world, working, fulfilling obligations, maintaining relationships, but inside, the soul begins to wither. Psychic suffering manifests itself in different ways: anxiety, depression, compulsions, existential crises. And often, these symptoms are not illnesses in themselves, but signs that the soul is crying out for reconnection with that which has been forgotten, repressed, or denied. Jung observed that, in many cases, what the patient needed was not a logical explanation, but a re-encounter with the symbolic dimension of life. This could happen through art, active imagination, dreams, or even through the reunion with some religious symbol that, although rationally forgotten, still inhabited the unconscious with full force. And it is at this point that he makes a powerful distinction between living religion and dead religion. A living religion is one that pulsates within the individual, that speaks to his soul, and that allows transformation. Dead religion, on the other hand, is a set of empty rituals, automatic repetitions that no longer dialogue with the inner world. For Jung, true religion is not necessarily in churches or temples, but in the personal experience of the sacred, that which transforms us profoundly and puts us in touch with the mystery of life. That is why he said that many people who came to his office did not need analysis, but a genuine religious experience. They sought, even if unconsciously, an experience of totality, something that would give meaning to suffering, that would organize internal chaos, and that would point to a path of reintegration. The absence of this symbolic experience leaves room for the individual to project the sacred in distorted places. Jung warned that when religious symbols are not consciously recognized, they continue to act, but in an unconscious and often destructive way. The result of this can be the idolatry of ideologies, the cult of the image, fanaticism, or even psychological collapse. In other words, the religious impulse does not disappear, it just transforms. And, if it is not integrated in a healthy way, it can manifest as obsession, fear, or delirium. Therefore, understanding the role of religion in the human psyche is not only a philosophical or cultural issue, but an existential urgency. Jung believed that each individual needed, at some point, to face the inner emptiness and seek a meaning that was true to them. It didn't matter if it came through Christianity, Buddhism, art, or the contemplation of nature. What mattered was the authenticity of the experience, the willingness to listen to the symbols that arise from the unconscious, and the courage to follow the path of individuation, the process of becoming who you really are. This path is not always easy. It requires coping, introspection, and often the reconstruction of beliefs that have been inherited but never truly understood. And it is exactly at this point that Jung leads us to the heart of his proposal, the journey of self-knowledge as a deeply spiritual act. But after all, what does this process of individuation mean? How does it relate to religion, to symbols, and to the collective unconscious? Individuation, for Jung, is not just an abstract concept or a distant ideal. It is a real, deep, and continuous process that happens throughout life. It represents the movement of the psyche towards wholeness, towards the integration of all its parts, conscious and unconscious, lights and shadows, reason and feeling. Contrary to what many imagine, individuating yourself does not mean becoming a better person in the moral or social sense, but rather becoming what you really are in its most authentic and essential fullness. This journey almost always begins with a crisis. A moment when the old way of living no longer makes sense, when the ready-made answers no longer satisfy and something inside us begins to disturb. It can come in the form of inexplicable pain, a void that fills nothing, or even through disturbing dreams. It is at this moment that the unconscious begins to manifest itself with more intensity, inviting the ego to start a dialogue with the hidden parts of the soul. And, as Jung said, this invitation is usually not made with kindness. It is more of an urgent call, a silent cry for transformation. In this process, symbols play a key role. They are the bridges between the conscious and the unconscious, between what we know and what we have yet to discover. The symbol is not a rational explanation. It is a living image, charged with psychic energy, which points to a deeper meaning. When a religious symbol, for example, appears in a dream or in an inner vision, it is not just repeating a cultural idea. It is revealing something essential about the current state of the psyche and its path of growth. Individuation requires the individual to recognize these symbols, listen to them attentively, and integrate them into his or her life. It is a process that involves confronting the shadow, the rejected and denied aspects of oneself, and encountering the self, which Jung considered the center of the total personality. The self is the archetype of totality, the organizing nucleus that guides the process of psychic development. And this encounter with the self is, for Jung, a deeply religious experience, even if it does not involve a formal religion. At this point, we understand why Jung stated that every journey of genuine self-knowledge is, deep down, a spiritual journey. Religion, in this context, is not a set of external beliefs, but an internal experience of reconnection with the sacred that dwells in each one of us. Therefore, the process of individuation can be seen as a liturgy of the soul, a path of sacralization of existence, where each step, each pain, each discovery contributes to the formation of a more whole, more conscious, and more connected being with oneself. This path, however, is not done alone. Although individuation is a deeply personal process, it is also reflected in relationships, social conflicts, and even cultural movements. When a society as a whole loses contact with its living symbols, it also enters into crisis. Culture becomes superficial, values are emptied, and collective suffering increases. That is why Jung saw in-depth psychology not only a therapeutic tool, but also a civilizing one. He believed that the more individuals consciously engaged with their own psyche, the greater the possibility of collective transformation. And it is precisely at this point that the Jungian approach offers us a precious key, the possibility of rescuing the sacred within us, not as an imposed belief, but as a living experience, which transforms, heals, and gives meaning. The process of individuation teaches us that the true temple is not outside but inside the soul, and that contact with that temple is what makes life truly meaningful. But this inner journey raises a fundamental question. How, in practice, can we reconnect with these symbols? How to access this sacred dimension in the midst of routine, the pressures of the modern world, and the rationality that so often suffocates mystery. Reconnecting with the symbols that inhabit the unconscious is not something that can be done only with intellectual effort. It is a sensitive dive, a movement of inner listening that requires presence, openness, and willingness to deal with the unknown. Jung knew that in an increasingly outward-looking world where everything needs to be fast, measurable, and productive, this kind of listening is becoming increasingly rare, but also increasingly necessary. The first way to access the symbolic world is through dreams. For Jung, dreams were not random residues of the brain, but coded messages from the unconscious. They carry symbols, images, and narratives that reveal hidden aspects of the psyche and indicate paths to healing and growth. Observing dreams carefully, writing down their images, trying to understand them with the help of symbolism and intuition is one of the richest ways to reconnect with the sacred within. And it is not necessary to be a psychologist or specialist to start this process. All it takes is curiosity, honesty, and the willingness to listen to what the soul is trying to say. Another powerful path is art. Jung saw in artistic creation a form of direct expression of the unconscious. Painting, writing, drawing, dancing, all of this can function as a living symbolic language, capable of giving shape to what is not yet fully conscious. Art, when it is not only used to please or entertain, but as a channel of authentic expression, turns into a ritual of reconnection with the self. For this reason, many of Jung's own patients produced images, mandalas, stories, elements that help them organize the inner chaos and discover hidden meanings in their experiences. The contemplation of nature is also a powerful path. Jung spent much of his life in contact with natural environments, and his famous tower in Balingen was more than a refuge. It was a sacred space where he could silence the noise of the world and listen to his own soul. Nature, with its cycles, its forms, and its mystery, rescues in us an ancestral memory. Being silent in front of a landscape, feeling the wind, watching the fire, listening to the sound of water, all this awakens dormant archetypes and reconnects us with a wisdom deeper than any rational discourse. And there are also rituals, not necessarily traditional religious ones, but personal ones, created from what makes sense for each one. Light a candle with intention, write a diary as a form of dialogue with the unconscious, take a moment of the day to meditate, give thanks, or just reflect sincerely. Small gestures that, when done consciously, acquire symbolic value and work as spiritual anchors in the routine. Jung believed that human beings need rituals, not as obligations, but as ways to mark the passage of time, to give meaning to experiences and to keep the connection with mystery alive. The most important thing in all these ways is authenticity. The symbol is only revealed when there is truth in the gaze. If the person seeks ready-made answers, dogmas, or magic formulas, he will hardly find anything transformative. But if she enters this process with openness, humility, and a real willingness to know herself, the symbols begin to emerge, first subtly, then more clearly, as silent guides pointing the way home. And it is precisely at this point that the symbolic journey becomes a healing experience. Because by rediscovering the deep meanings of life, the individual ceases to be a fragment lost in the world and begins to perceive himself as part of a larger, rich, mysterious, and deeply meaningful narrative. But for this healing to be complete, it is necessary to look at a dimension that many still avoid: the shadow. The hidden side of the psyche, where we keep everything we don't want to see. The journey towards self-knowledge and psychic integration inevitably involves confronting the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is everything that the ego refuses to recognize in itself: repressed aspects, denied feelings, rejected impulses. It is not necessarily evil or destructive, but rather the hidden side of the personality, which has been pushed into the unconscious because it does not fit the ideal image we have built of ourselves. Ignoring the shadow is one of the greatest dangers in the journey of individuation. This is because what is not recognized internally tends to manifest itself externally, often in a distorted way. We project our anger, envy, fear, or insecurity onto others, blaming the world for conflicts that actually originate within us. Jung said that, as long as you do not make conscious what is in the unconscious, it will direct your life and you will call it destiny. It's a powerful wake-up call about the importance of looking at what bothers us, what we avoid, and even what we condemn in others, because often these elements are reflecting parts of ourselves that we haven't yet accepted. Facing the shadow does not mean giving in to the most destructive impulses, but rather consciously acknowledging, understanding, and integrating them. This is a painful but liberating process. When we embrace the shadow, we stop fighting ourselves. We develop compassion, not only for our own limitations, but also for those of others. The shadow ceases to be a hidden enemy and becomes an ally in the process of psychic and spiritual maturation. Many religious symbols, in fact, represent this process of confrontation. The myth of the descent into hell, present in various traditions, such as the story of Jesus, the journey of Orpheus, or the labors of Hercules, is, in fact, a powerful metaphor about the need to face inner darkness in order to then emerge transformed. Jung saw in these myths a mirror of the psychological process: the descent into the unconscious, the confrontation with the internal monsters, and, finally, the conquest of a new consciousness. This confrontation also protects us from another subtle risk, that of false lighting. When a person seeks only the light, the good, that which is high and spiritual, without looking at his own darkness, he runs the risk of becoming rigid, moralistic, or even fanatical. Jung called this ego inflation, an exaggerated identification with an idealized image of oneself, which blocks true growth. True spirituality, for him, is not escaping the shadow, but integrating it with awareness. Therefore, the path of self-knowledge requires courage. Courage to question certainties, to revisit wounds, to welcome contradictions. But in doing so, the individual becomes whole. And it is in this state of wholeness that the sacred really manifests itself, not as an abstract idea, but as a living, intimate, and transforming presence. Religion, at this point in the journey, is no longer just belief or tradition. It is a direct experience of integration. It is a reconnection with the self, with the totality of the psyche, with the divine that dwells in each one. Reaching this level of consciousness does not mean reaching an end, but inaugurating a new way of being in the world. Life comes to be seen as a continuous process of learning, listening to the unconscious, dialoguing with symbols, and reconciling with the shadow. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for deepening, every crisis a chance for rebirth. And it is from this internal place, more integral and connected, that we can look at the world with different eyes. But after all, what does Jung's vision of religion and psyche teach us about the future of spirituality in modern society? And how can we apply this knowledge in a practical way in our lives? Carl Jung's vision of religion, psyche, and self-knowledge invites us to look inward with more depth, sensitivity, and truth. Throughout his work, he did not try to prove the existence of an external God, nor to defend a specific religion. His interest was in another direction, to understand the essential role that the experience of the sacred has in the psychological structure of the human being. For Jung, the religious impulse is natural, spontaneous, and universal. It springs from the unconscious as a psychic need for meaning, for totality, for reconnection with something greater. Spirituality, in this context, is not limited to dogmas or doctrines, but manifests itself as a legitimate search for integration and meaning. Jung showed us that when we move away from the symbols that shape this inner dimension, we don't become freer, we become more vulnerable to emptiness, alienation, and existential suffering. Religion, understood as a living and symbolic experience, then becomes a profound language of the soul, a bridge between the visible and the invisible world, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the ego and the self. During the process of individuation, we learn that this reconnection requires effort, listening, and sincerity. It is not a matter of following ready-made models or seeking external answers, but of undertaking an intimate and courageous journey towards one's own wholeness. Dreams, symbols, art, nature, and rituals are powerful tools on this path, gateways to an inner reality that, although often forgotten, is still alive in each of us. And if the sacred dwells within, then true spirituality is not only in the temples, but in the way we live, feel, choose, and relate to life. The encounter with the shadow, as uncomfortable as it may be, is necessary for this spirituality to be real and transformative. There is no authentic light without the recognition of darkness. There is no profound growth without the acceptance of what is imperfect, contradictory, and human. Jung reminds us that the great challenge of our time is not to choose between faith and reason, science, or religion, but to find a path of reconciliation between these dimensions. We need a spirituality that does not run away from the world, but that helps to understand it more deeply. A spirituality that does not deny pain, but that gives meaning to it. May it not imprison us in certainties, but teach us to inhabit the mystery with humility. When we understand what Jung wanted to show us about religion, we leave the field of blind belief and enter the fertile ground of symbolic experience. We have come to see life as a process of constant discovery, where every challenge carries a hidden meaning, and every symbol that emerges from the unconscious can be a guide on our journey. If there is something we can take away from this reflection, it is the certainty that the sacred is not far away. It pulsates in our dreams, in our doubts, in our crises, and also in our moments of silence. It is up to each of us to decide whether we will ignore him or listen to his call. And if this content resonated with you, if it sparked something within you, consider subscribing to the channel to continue this journey with us. Here, we will explore together the paths of self-knowledge, depth psychology, and living spirituality. After all, the soul thirsts for meaning and is always waiting for those who are ready to listen to it.